Throughout the vast and turbulent expanse of human civilization, few substances have been granted a status nearing the divine. It is our daily bread, a fundamental holy communion of survival. For the humble peasants of medieval Europe, bread was more than mere sustenance. It was the primary fuel of life, the singular force that allowed them to endure the crushing weight of their existence. But have you ever stopped to wonder, what if this sacred gift was tainted at its very source? What if the life-giving grain was marked for a debt of death before it even broke through the soil? Imagine the year 1089. A remote village in the heart of France has just endured a spring of unnatural cold and relentless dampness. To the weary farmer, the falling rain initially signaled a promise of a bountiful harvest. However, beneath the saturated earth, an invisible and ancient debt was quietly compounding its interest, hidden within the very stalks of the rye they so desperately relied upon. On the soaked and heavy ears of the rye, a strange and monstrous growth began to manifest. It was slender, curved, and possessed a hauntingly beautiful yet unsettling violet-black hue. The peasants gazed upon these oddities without alarm. Some even whispered that these mother grains foretold a double harvest. They were tragically mistaken. This was no gift of nature, but a parasitic predator known as Claviceps purpurea, the ergot fungus. As the massive stone mills turned with a rhythmic, grinding groan, they crushed these devil's horns into the pure white flour, transforming the foundation of life into a vehicle for a lethal toxin, ergotamine. It became a colorless, tasteless poison waiting in every oven, sitting upon every family table. That night, the fragile silence of the village was shattered by a scream of pure, primal agony. A man burst from his home, plunging his hands into the freezing darkness of a stone well, shrieking that his very flesh was being consumed by an invisible, infernal fire. Ergotamine is a cold and relentless chemical locksmith. Once it infiltrates the human bloodstream, it performs a singular, devastating task. It forcefully constricts the capillaries, effectively turning off the flow of life to the body's extremities. This is not a pain that originates on the surface of the skin. It is a biological hallucination that feels as though it is burning outward from the very marrow of the bones. The victims suffer through a journey of escalating horror. At first, there is a frantic, needle-like numbness, a desperate prickling of the nerves. But soon, the searing sensation of being burned alive begins to fade, replaced by a far more terrifying state, a cold, absolute, and silent deadness. This is the onset of what modern medicine classifies as dry gangrene. Because the supply of oxygenated blood has been completely severed, the victim's fingers, toes, and eventually entire limbs begin to mummify. While the sufferer remains fully conscious and agonizingly aware, their flesh turns an abyssal black, shriveling and hardening until it becomes as brittle and fragile as a piece of discarded charcoal. The most macabre detail of this affliction is the manner in which it concludes. The shedding of these dead limbs is typically an entirely bloodless affair. Because the tissue is already dry and mummified, the hands and feet simply snap off, much like a withered branch breaking away from a dying oak tree. They fall to the frozen ground with a hollow, rhythmic thud, a sound that haunted the nightmares of entire generations. In an era devoid of scientific understanding, the populace could only interpret this horror as a direct punishment from God. Desperate hordes of the burning ones flocked to the monasteries of the Order of St. Anthony, crawling on their remaining stumps to beg for divine intervention. There is a profound irony in their salvation. The monks provided these pilgrims with fresh, pure bread made from untainted grain. This miraculous healing was not brought about by holy water or sacred relics, but by the simple cessation of the poison. Yet, in the eyes of the broken and the blind, the sudden halting of the rot was a celestial mercy, a final settlement of the debt, paid in the currency of the limbs they had left scattered along the pilgrimage road. But the debt of flesh was only the beginning of the reckoning. Hidden within the blackened grain lay another, more insidious toxin, one that bypassed the bloodstream and struck directly at the theater of the human mind. This variant of ergotism did not just shrivel the body, it shattered the soul. Victims began to see the very fabric of reality tear open before their eyes. They witnessed celestial fires dancing in the sky and heard the frantic whispers of long-dead ancestors rising from the cold earth. This was the onset of mass convulsive ergotism, a terrifying spectacle of collective madness. Entire villages would descend into a state of rhythmic, involuntary delirium. Men, women, and children would surge into the village squares, their bodies twisting in grotesque, puppet-like contortions. They would dance with a frantic, supernatural energy, their limbs jerking in a rhythmic agony that they could neither understand nor control. In the eyes of a medieval observer, this was not a medical crisis. It was a demonic invasion. They called it the dancing plague, a frenzied ritual of the damned where the exhausted participants would leap and spin until their hearts gave out or their bones snapped from the sheer force of their own convulsions. This chaotic descent into madness left a dark, indelible fingerprint on the pages of history. Fast forward to the year 1692, in the infamous settlement of Salem. When young girls began to suffer from inexplicable contortions, violent fits, and piercing screams, the Puritan community looked not to the granary, but to the supernatural. Modern toxicologists now cast a suspicious eye on the damp rye harvest of that fateful year, suggesting that the specters the girls claimed to see were actually the chemical phantoms of ergot poisoning. You see, the alkaloids produced by the ergot fungus are the direct chemical precursors to LSD, one of the most potent hallucinogens known to man. In an era where fear was the primary currency, these fungus-induced visions were misinterpreted as the handiwork of the devil. The vivid hallucinations of flying through the air or feeling the prick of invisible needles became the primary evidence used to send innocent women to the gallows. The debt of the ergot fungus was no longer just paid in shriveled limbs. It was now being settled in the blood of those accused of witchcraft. The invisible fire had evolved from a physiological torture into a social conflagration that burned through entire communities, fueled by a fungus that thrived in the dark, damp corners of the human world. As the dawn of the Enlightenment broke over the scarred landscape of Europe, the long, terrifying shadow of Saint Anthony finally began to dissipate under the cold light of reason. Scientists of the 19th century no longer viewed the invisible fire as a divine lash or a demonic curse. Instead, they placed the blackened grain beneath the analytical gaze of the microscope. What they discovered was not a fragment of hell, but a sophisticated chemical factory of staggering complexity. The very alkaloids that had once shriveled the limbs of peasants were found to possess a dual nature. In lethal doses, they strangled the flow of life. Yet, when measured with precision, they possessed the near-miraculous power to staunch life-threatening hemorrhages in childbirth. This marked a profound turning point in our eternal debt to the natural world. Humanity had begun the perilous process of attempting to harvest the reaper's scythe, transforming a weapon of mass destruction into a tool of surgical healing. The era of blind superstition was fading, giving way to a new age where the secrets of the ergot fungus were being decoded, one molecular bond at a time. The story took its most surreal turn in 1938, within the sterile confines of a Swiss laboratory. A chemist named Albert Hofmann was searching for a stimulant to aid the circulatory system when he synthesized a derivative of ergot called LSD-25. For 5 years, the compound sat in obscurity until an accidental exposure led Hofmann into the most significant St. Anthony's fire of the modern era. As he rode his bicycle home through the streets of Basel, the world dissolved into a shimmering kaleidoscope of geometric fractals and impossible colors. He had become the first modern pioneer to navigate the hallucinatory ocean that had once driven entire medieval villages to madness. This was the ultimate evolution of the ergot debt. In the hands of science, the fungus had shifted from a destroyer of flesh to a challenger of the ego. It no longer merely crippled the body, it began to question the very architecture of human consciousness. The ancient devil's horn had been reborn as a key, unlocking a door to a psychedelic realm that would go on to reshape art, philosophy, and the counterculture of the 20th century. Today, the ergot fungus is no longer the grim reaper that claims thousands of lives in a single season. Modern agriculture has learned to screen the grain and suppress the breath of the fungus through chemical precision. But has this invisible debt truly been settled? As we feed the world through the industrial monoculture of a single crop, we create a sprawling nursery for the next unknown evolution of fungal life. Nature never forgets a single balance. It merely waits for the next damp spring to collect its due. The St. Anthony's fire of the past was a physiological torture, but the modern ergot is a silent metaphor for our fragile balance with the environment. The story of ergot reminds us that the progress of civilization is often built upon a temporary loan from the natural world. The next time you break open a piece of soft warm bread, remember the violet glow of the invisible fire. This is a debt that we may never truly pay in full. This is the hidden cost, and I will see you in the next dark chapter of our history.